Today's World Insight, a crucible of global leadership in tough times. An eminent academic tells us why moral leaders and soft power matter.
China and the U.S. should be looking for some common projects.
The geopolitics of a pandemic, in the words of a former UN diplomat.
The United States has continued its geopolitical contest with China in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis.
And Japan walks a tightrope in keeping a lid on the coronavirus and keeping its economy alive. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The implication of COVID-19 pandemic on global trade, cross-border investment, and global supply chains and globalization are increasingly obvious and also sobering. In a testing era, what's the role and essence of leadership? What have we learned from history about communication and cooperation? What's the next step for China-U.S. ties? Bearing all these questions in mind, earlier I talked to Joseph Nye, former dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also known for coining the term soft power. Let's listen in. How big a test do you think is it of leadership this round of pandemic worldwide?
I think the COVID-19 pandemic is an enormous test of current leadership. And you would think that the leaders in the world would realize that it's important to come together, but instead they're spending too much time competing with each other and not enough time competing against the virus. So I think in that sense it's a great test of leadership, but I'm not sure that the leadership has passed it. We have to realize that in addition to the traditional ways of thinking about power over other countries, we have to realize that there's a new set of issues which require us to change our thinking to incorporate the idea of power with others. So you take something like climate change, or you take something like the current pandemic, there's no way in which one country can solve it by itself. It's just impossible. The virus doesn't know borders, it doesn't care about nationalities, and neither does climate change, where carbon dioxide doesn't recognize national borders. So in that sense, if China does better on its public health or on its reducing its carbon emissions, that's good for China, but it's also good for the U.S. and vice versa. If the U.S. is better on those measures, that's good for the U.S. and it's good for China.
You've been writing a book linking morals to leadership, talking about the presidency for generations. Tell me more about whether leadership has learned through history. After all, there was a great influenza back in 1918, and apparently lessons have not been learned?
Well, the influenza in 1918 actually killed more people than died during World War I. So it had a terrible effect, but it didn't lead the world to create an effective prevention regime. We did create, after World War II, the World Health Organization, but no country has given the WHO the degree of resources or authority which we really need. So I would say in that sense it's true. We haven't learned enough. There have been incidents of cooperation, but we haven't done enough.
Paralysis of a WHO mechanism, that seems to be some political intentions of some. What do you make of that at this moment of a critical pandemic?
Well, I think President Trump has made a bad mistake in terms of putting too much blame on the WHO. In fact, the WHO represents the will of the member governments, and the member governments haven't given it enough authority to do what it needs to do. So Trump's blaming of the WHO is just trying to shift blame away from himself. And I think it doesn't help the WHO, it weakens the WHO.
Many have been following you about is the terminology soft power. Now you yourself invented that terminology, and that has been used as a barometer by many leadership around the world to see how their policies are matching with realities. Tell me more about your evolution, in a way, academic evolution, from soft power to what you are thinking now as morals and leadership.
Well, soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And if you have a moral stance as a country, it makes you more attractive to other countries, and that increases your soft power as a country. So the recent book that I've written, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from Roosevelt to Trump, it tries to look at the 14 presidents since 1945 and ask to what extent did their moral views affect foreign policy, and was that good for the United States? And I think the answer is that for many presidents, they did try to use moral approaches to foreign policy, and that was good for the United States. Unfortunately, President Trump is the least moral of the 14 presidents that I study in this history. And I think that has led to a reduction in American soft power.
If you look at the elites and the scientific communities and some of the very influential individuals such as Dr. Fauci and some of the others that are standing out in the United States right now in terms of cooperating with the others and also trying to work for the common good, there seems to be a huge disconnect between the current administration and these groups of people. The divide going on in the U.S. politics and the U.S. elite's capabilities to shaping the policies within the country and its foreign policies as well. What do you make of that?
Well, that's correct. If you look at the scientific community, there is an interest in cooperating across borders because they see the common enemy as the virus. But the problems of the U.S.-China relationship had already begun to go sour before the pandemic occurred. So there was already a resentment or a difficulty in the relationship. You might think that with the common threat from the virus, it would allow us to put these pre-existing conditions into a broader perspective. Instead, I'm afraid what's happened is that the competition of blame, one side blaming the other, and let's be honest, both sides have blamed the other, that's made things worse rather than better. So rather than the common enemy of the virus uniting us, we've gotten into a situation where we're each trying to shift blame onto the other. That's not good for anybody.
So, Professor Nye, you're trying to suggest in a way that as a result of the geopolitical situations, some of the elite groups inside the United States have been muted or silenced by the realities?
Well, I think you'll find that in the scientific community, there is still a very strong interest in cooperating with Chinese scientists and medical personnel. So I don't think that they are silenced or unable to. But in terms of the political situation, the sense of looking at the fact that our relationship with China is going to be what I called a cooperative rivalry, which is, yes, there'll be areas of rivalry, but there are other areas where we have to cooperate with each other, and we have to learn to do both of those things at the same time. Well, in the recent events and the way that Trump has responded, we're spending too much time on the rivalry and not enough time on the cooperation.
But isn't that mean that the elite groups, if I could put this word to describe them, in the U.S. has failed to influence some of the most crucial policies, whether it's domestic as reflected this time by the strategies against the pandemic within the country, and also about its foreign policy, for example, its relations with China? After all, from this perspective, from China, China virus, quote unquote, was first said by the president, and now Secretary of State Pompeo keep on saying it was from the lab in Wuhan without providing any evidence.
Both sides are making a mistake to see this as a competition for propaganda gain. We really have much more to gain from cooperation. There still are a number of Americans, the elites as you refer to them, in the press and in the foreign policy community and in the universities, who are interested in trying to preserve a working relationship with China. And I think President Trump and Secretary Pompeo have been irresponsible in the language they've used. But I think the important thing is China and the U.S. should be looking for some common projects or something that we could do together to symbolize the fact that we have more to gain from cooperation than from the rivalry. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that.
We know the pandemic is still going on, unfortunately, around the world. What do you say, Professor Nye, with someone, I know you are a patriot and also of one with vision when it comes to the U.S. road ahead. At this point, what would be your advice to your leadership, sir?
Well, I have written columns and tried to propose the idea that the U.S. should join with China and other countries in the group of 20 to establish a major fund to help poor countries cope with the coronavirus. Last week, a number of European countries held a conference to pledge resources for that.
Final question for you, since you talk about the Europe. Let me ask you, what does that mean? China and the United States only at 40% of the global GDP, 60% coming from other parts of the world. How are they watching the countries are coping with their own domestic pandemic situation and also their outreach to the others to support?
We have to take the lead in trying to deal with issues I call transnational issues, which don't respect borders, which includes both pandemics, which is bothering the world now, but also the slower but equally important issue of climate change. It's not killing us in the short run, but it can in the long run. And China and the U.S. together, for example, put 40% of the carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's a good example of cooperate. We can't do it alone, and if we don't cooperate together, other countries aren't going to be able to do it either. So the pandemic and the climate change are similar in the sense that the two largest economies, the U.S. being the largest and China being the second largest, have to come together and cooperate if the world is going to see any leadership on this.
Right.
And I find the current situation discouraging that we haven't accomplished this.
Professor Joseph Nye, talking about morals and leadership and the importance of China-U.S. relations. You're watching World Insight, still to come on the program. The spread of the coronavirus is only matched by geopolitical tensions. How do we make sense of this worrying trend? A former Singaporean diplomat offers his insight right after this break. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. As the world grapples with the coronavirus, experts have called for global solidarity and cooperation. Despite rising tensions, they believe the U.S. and China must work together to turn the tide against the pandemic. Mr. Kishore Mahbubani believes so. He's a distinguished fellow from the Asia Research Institute with National University of Singapore. He shares his views on geopolitics and the pandemic. Professor, tell us about your thought on the latest pandemic, COVID-19, and its impact, it seems, on the geopolitical discussion we've been having.
Well, I think COVID-19, as you know, a massive challenge to our world. And the logical thing for humanity to do is to focus on these major challenges from COVID-19 and set aside all other differences for now in this life and death battle against this virus. But sadly, the world hasn't done that. And sadly also, the United States has continued its geopolitical contest with China in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis. And I have tried to argue in my book, Has China Won?, that frankly, there are no fundamental differences of interest between US and China. And certainly when it comes to COVID-19, the US and China should be cooperating with each other for the benefit of the world rather than continuing the contest at this dangerous time. The medical communities in the world understand that 7.5 billion people belong to one species.
That's right.
You know, when the virus crosses borders, the virus doesn't say, are you Chinese? Are you Indian? Are you American? Are you European? They don't care. The virus will attack you because you are human. So all of us, the human species, must come together as one species and fight this virus. So let's forget our nationality and let's stop attacking each other politically. And the best way to do that is to bring together the doctors. So as you know, in the previous crisis, when we had Ebola, when we had SARS, American and Chinese scientists were working together. So this time around, for COVID-19, we should also ask American and Chinese scientists to work together because the virus is attacking everybody, not one country.
But I'm not sure whether it is right now for some. For example, Professor Mahbubani, you argue in your book, Has China Won? Of course, by the way, that's a curious title you have over there. You're not trying to answer that question directly, but rather to pose a question over there. Professor Mahbubani, you argue about some of the Cold War mentality coming back in some people's mind. Tell me more about what you're thinking. What do you mean? And where is China, where is the United States now in that set of format you have just posed in your book?
Well, the reason why a lot of this Cold War reflexes are coming back is because, you know, I begin my book, Tian Wei, by describing a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger in his private club in March 2018, 2 years ago. And at the end of the lunch, the impression I got from Dr. Henry Kissinger was that the United States had made a mistake in launching a geopolitical contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy on how to handle the geopolitical contest. And because of that, things are being done very impulsively, irrationally, and often with no strategy. And in many ways, I also begin the book by quoting from another man, another great American strategic thinker, George Kennan, who gave the United States very valuable advice. He said, before you start a geopolitical contest against the Soviet Union, the former Cold War, he says, first, you must focus on your domestic strength. That's the most important thing. Number two, you must build up friends and allies. And number three, you mustn't insult your enemies. And number four, you must be humble. Now, these are 4 pieces of advice that George Kennan gave in 1949, and the United States today, sadly, is not following any of these 4 pieces of advice. For example, in terms of its national condition, the United States, which used to be the most successful country on planet Earth, has become the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. Now, George Kennan would disapprove and say, hey, first we have to fix our country before we go and getting engaged in geopolitical contests. And he would also say, why don't you talk to our friends and allies around the world and see what they're saying? And if the United States actually took an effort to listen to other countries, most other countries are advising the United States, please don't get involved in this geopolitical contest. Let us focus on our common needs and challenges. And certainly today, let us focus on COVID-19 and not get caught in another geopolitical contest. So all the very wise advice given by Henry Kissinger, given by George Kennan, is not being listened to today.
Professor Mahbubani, of course, internal politics always has become the priority for many politicians, and therefore not necessarily handling the crisis well back at home has to have its own excuses. Now we see geopolitics has been used as a tool for that, isn't it?
Internal politics, especially in democratic societies, is also about winning the trust and confidence of your own population. And if your own population feels very endangered and threatened by this virus, it becomes very dangerous to play political games with it. You may get some short-term political victories by playing games with it, but at the end of the day, the people can be very well informed, and they can tell when a leader is doing well and improving the situation, like, for example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's very, very focused on COVID-19, whereas in the United States, sadly, the politicians are trying to make political capital out of it, and as a result of it, again, very sadly, the number of deaths and the number of cases in the United States is now incredibly large. And it shows that there hasn't been insufficient attention being paid to fighting COVID-19 first.
One after another accusation after China and some of the other Asian countries like South Korea, like Singapore, where you are, have been able to climb on their own out of the crisis as a result of COVID-19. What does that say about people's ability to recognize what should be learned and what should be the strategies forward? But now we see more accusations and rather a comparison of notes.
It's very clear that by and large, East Asian societies like China, like South Korea, like Singapore, have done relatively well at managing this COVID-19, relatively speaking, but it has to do about the fact that East Asian societies believe basically in what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen said, that for societies to succeed, you need the invisible hand of free markets and the visible hand of good governance. Unfortunately, in the West, and especially I would say in the United States, they used to listen to President Ronald Reagan, who used to say, government is not the solution, government is the problem. So as a result of that, there has been a progressive defunding, delegitimization, and of course consequentially demoralization of the public service agencies in the United States and to some extent in the other Western countries. And so I think that was a mistake that they made. And so the time has come perhaps for the West to try in some ways learn some lessons from East Asia and realize that for societies to succeed, you have to strengthen institutions of government as well as the private sector if a society is going to succeed.
Kishore Mahbubani, COVID-19 vis-a-vis geopolitics. You're watching World Insight, still to come on our program today. Japan's strategy for containing the pandemic relies on self-restraint. Can Japan maintain its economy while keeping the virus at bay? Welcome back. Now we turn to Japanese efforts to contain the coronavirus spread. Japan's nationwide state of emergency has been extended until the end of this month. Japan's law do not allow the government to enforce a full lockdown. Instead, it went with a self-restraint approach. Can these measures be effective? And there's also reports of limited testing capacities in Japan. The country has had over 15,000 confirmed cases. So on those questions and more, I talked to Professor Koji Wada, a member of the Faculty of Medicine at the International University of Health and Welfare. He explains how Japan is working to contain the virus after enduring 3 weeks of tight restrictions, and how can Japan strike a balance between keeping the economy alive and also the public health. Tell me more about this extension of emergency inside Japan until the end of May. What does that mean?
Yes, on 7th April, Prime Minister Abe declared the state of emergency until today. The government expected to reduce the contact of persons up to 20% of the usual time. It means 80% reduction. So that was really tough target. However, most companies and individuals follow this request voluntarily. And of course, there have been some criticisms if this timing was not really fast enough, and maybe the request for the volunteer actions may be not enough. But however, many people follow this instruction. And fortunately, the number of patients in Tokyo and the other areas of Japan has been reduced very much. But still, we may have some hospitals or areas which have very critical conditions of the hospital occupancy by the COVID-19 patients. And we also need to push all the prefectures have more sufficient systems or capacities for the coming second wave of the COVID-19 patients.
Dr. Koji, now Japan, if you look at the official number, 15,000 confirmed cases, deaths about 500. So that's relatively well controlled so far. But people are also asking about whether there's sufficient testing involved to know exactly what is happening and whether there's asymptomatic problems. There are a lot of questions that others have experienced and also now facing Japan. Tell me more about that.
Yes, the government has also working for improving the capacity for the PCR testing. And until maybe today, usually we provide the PCR testing prioritizing for the severe patients, and not for the older patients who may have symptoms like a coughing or fever. But we expect that most severe patients have a chance to have the PCR testing. But of course, there have been some arguments. Maybe we may also prepare for the more capacities for the almost all the patients who may have symptoms. But fortunately, maybe sooner or later, we are going to have the kind of the testing kit for the very rapid testing.
Dr. Koji, what is the daily testing capacity now, generally speaking, for Japan?
Yes, the government said we have 20,000 capacities for conducting PCR testing. But
daily.
However,
that is daily.
Daily, yes, that's daily. But the PCR testing is really, how can I say, it takes time and energies, like for example, like taking the samples and transferring to the laboratory testing, and then return to the hospitals and give it to the patient. So there are lots of steps to conducting the PCR testing. The capacity itself is also limited. So we really need to consider how we could implement PCR testing efficiently and effectively.
Yeah. Accuracy of PCR testing is a problem worldwide. And now, earlier I talked to some Chinese doctors coming from Wuhan. They were telling me about 50% accurate rate, but people still have to do testing because that's probably the only way we could know about the situation. So what about for Japan? And you talk about the developing of the new test kits. What about the accurate rate of that, if we know?
Yes, the devices which we are going to introduce soon is a kind of the identifying the antigen of the COVID. So, you know, the PCR testing is really like accurate.
Yes.
But of course, they have some limitations. But even small number of virus we can detect by the PCR testing. But what we are going to focus on is who are transmitted to the others. Such a rapid testing, which we are going to introduce, can detect the antigen, but it's less accuracy comparing with PCR testing. But at least we can identify who may transmit to others, so that if we get a positive result, and if the patient have the fever or coughing, and he may transmit to the others. So we have very critical quarantines for those patients and stay at home and or hospitals, and then we can suppress the outbreak from that patient.
Okay.
So that's going to be a strategy for us.
How many people will be tested a day? How long will that test take?
It takes maybe 15 minutes if we get samples, and we are expecting to get samples through the nose, but we are also trying to this device can be identify the virus in the saliva, so that it's going to be very easy to take in samples and test. But we are still doing some experiment and confirming the validity of testing kit.
Now, as far as I know, Dr. Koji, there are not specific laws and enforcement measures for people to follow the state of emergency. I mean, in terms of quarantine and social distancing. They have to follow what they consider as correct and socially acceptable. So, Dr. Koji, do you think with the extension of emergency, will people still be able to do it well?
Yes, the state of emergency in Japan is not really like a strict restrictions for the people. We expect that everyone to follow the instructions or requests for the government. And actually, one reason is to extending the state of emergency is we can expect a leadership of the governors of prefectures. So we have the 47 prefectures in Japan, and there are some like a city governors or prefecture governors, but based on the state of emergency, the prefecture governor can take the initiative how they are going to set up the hospital capacities, or how the government, the local government can expect people to shut down the shops or restaurants, and also the restricting the use of the buildings. So extending the state of emergency, we expect the prefecture governor can set up their systems, how they can going to tackle down with the COVID for the another wave of the patient or infection.
Yeah. How is it being done? I mean, without specific enforcement measures, how do you think the common people, besides the the local leaders that you've been talking about, be able to follow the social distancing and quarantine rules?
Yes. So the government also encouraging the people to have the new lifestyle to cohabit with the COVID-19. There are like three basic principles. One is like a physical distancing, and second is wearing a mask for the if they are going out, and third one is to washing their hands. So those three principles should be followed by everyone. But now the local government and everyone should have the kind of applications for those three basic principles to their daily lives. For example, like taking distance if they are waiting for the buying something at the supermarket, and also the taking distance in the train, and also the restricting the travel to other areas. So Japan have the very not really strict restrictions, but many people are voluntarily accepting that kind of behaviors. But maybe for we have some struggling with the taking the balance between the infection control and also the economy.
Yeah.
And in these 2-3 months, the many hotel industry and the restaurant and some other industries have been affected very much. And some economists say that it can be very severe for the economic conditions if we have the extension of the state of emergency. But the local government or prefecture governors can have taken the balance within the state of emergency period.
That's a great idea. Dr. Koji, another question is, we have seen, the countries and regions in East Asia relatively quite successful, if you look at the numbers, in terms of their containment of the pandemic. Now, in retrospect, what do you think that Asia, or particularly East Asia, has done right?
Yes, that's what we are also discussing, and that can be gives us a very good insight for the next 2-3 years, because the COVID-19 can exist everywhere in the world, and almost all the countries, include Japan and Korea and China, we are still closing the countries, and there have been very limited number of travelers in Asia or even in the globe. So we may need to open the countries soon. For example, welcoming some travelers from other countries to Japan or to China.
Is it possible that China, South Korea, and Japan open to one another, at least among the three, because they are relatively safe, at least within the countries? Is there a possibility? Are medical experts and epidemiologists like you thinking about that with your policymakers?
Yes, so that's the reason why we should have a very transparent communication between the countries, and sharing the accurate data and what kind of measures they are taking. And of course, we need to have the kind of risk assessment for the travelers. For example, for the healthcare workers, may have a relatively higher risk to be infected. Of course, for the individual risk assessment and also the country's or regional risk assessment is necessary. And then we should need to consider how we could open the countries each other. And that is going to be connected to the kind of cooperation or solidarity in the region. But maybe in the future, maybe during the winter time, maybe we are going to face very difficult situations. For example, we have the usual regular cold and influenza and the norovirus. We do not know if someone has the symptoms, it's because of the COVID or cold, or he has potential for the transmitting to others.
Dr. Koji, what about this debate as an epidemiologist yourself? See, in terms of, the roles of national governments and the roles of international cooperation in researching about the virus, in the treatment, and also in the prevention and control and mitigation?
Yes, there are lots of challenges we are going to have. One is for the having the very good treatment. We need to continue to work closely with other countries. And second thing is like a vaccination. And third thing is economy and also versus infection control. And yes, I know in not only in Japan, but all the countries are facing very difficult situation for the economy. And but we may identify how could we have the economic activities and also have a very optimal level of infection control.
And that will do it for this edition of World Insight. To find out more, you can always search us, World Insight CGTN, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.